faithfully sharing insights, exploring great books worldwide. Hi, this is Sally with Book Talks. Today we're delving into the book The Food Explorer, subtitled How a Globe-Trotting Botanist Transformed America's Diet. The United States is the world's largest agricultural exporter today. But over 100 years ago, U.S. agriculture was way behind, with only a few edible crops. People eat just to survive, not to enjoy or balance nutrition. A botanist changed all that. David Fairchild. He visited over 50 countries, bringing in more than 17,000 plants to America, making meals way more varied, especially with fruits and veggies. Today, we'll uncover this botanist's amazing journey through the Food Explorer. The author, Daniel Stone, teaches environmental policy at Johns Hopkins University and is a seasoned writer in environmental science, botany, and agriculture. He's been a Newsweek correspondent, covered the White House, and written for Time, National Geographic, and the Washington Post. Stone read Fairchild's manuscripts and interviewed his descendants to write this book, bringing his legendary life to life. All right, let's break down the book's main points with three big questions. First, how did Fairchild become a plant explorer? Second, how did his plant explorations transform U.S. farming? Third, why did bringing in new plants to America slow down? Okay, starting with the first question, how Fairchild became a plant explorer. In the late 1800s, century after independence, American meals were pretty dull. Apart from cattle and pigs for meat and milk, the U.S. grew mostly wheat and corn, with veggies and fruits scarce. Take veggies, only a few, like radishes and mustard greens that grew easily. A newspaper writer back then described meals: oatmeal for breakfast, bread and cheese for lunch. Dinner was boiled foods like dark broth, salted fish, roast pork or beans. In winter, many families ate just bread, butter, and bacon, with veggies and fruits rare. Back then, Americans' eating habits were shaped by two main reasons. Historically, the earliest immigrants were English Puritans. Now, Puritans valued simple diets and were hesitant to try new foods. On the other hand, America itself had a scarcity of plant species. About 2 million years ago, North America was covered in thick ice, with only a few plant species surviving. Until the 19th century, Native American crops were very limited, just strawberries, blueberries, pecans, pumpkins, and others brought by immigrants from Europe. Americans only had a few varieties like wheat, tobacco, peaches, and hadn't even seen many fruits and vegetables. At the 1876 World's Fair in Philadelphia, when bananas first appeared in the U.S., Americans were confused. How to eat them with a knife and fork? The book's protagonist, David Fairchild, was born in this era. In 1869, he was born in Michigan, then moved with his family to Kansas. His father, George, was an agricultural expert, once president of Kansas State Agricultural College. Influenced by his father, Fairchild was fascinated by plants from a young age. Besides his father, three others had a big impact on Fairchild, guiding him to plant exploration. The first was the famous British naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace. He traveled the world and co-proposed the theory of evolution with Darwin. Now, Wallace visited Kansas, posted by George, and young Fairchild got to meet this renowned naturalist. Wallace liked the smart, lively Fairchild and gave him his new book, The Malay Archipelago. The Malay Archipelago refers to the many islands in Southeast Asia today. In the book, Wallace describes his adventures in the Malay Archipelago and introduces its nature, scenery, and wildlife. Young Fairchild was captivated. He was most impressed by the exotic plants and animals of Java, vowing to explore it someday. But in the 19th century, global travel wasn't easy, so Fairchild kept his dream hidden for a while. He later studied botany at university, focusing on pest control. After graduation, Fairchild moved to Washington, D.C. and got a junior researcher position at the USDA Plant Pathology Division, mainly traveling to educate farmers about plant disease prevention. And, for example, he'd tirelessly demonstrate pear tree blight to farmers everywhere. He showed how pathogens killed pear seedlings In 1994, 25-year-old Fairchild secured Smithsonian funding to study algae cell division in Naples, Italy. On the ship to Naples, he met the second person who greatly influenced him. Well, globetrotter Barbara Lathrop was older than Fairchild, a 22-year-old American millionaire who loved global adventures. He'd already traveled the world over 40 times. When Fairchild learned Lathrop had visited Java, admiration welled up in him. He told Lathrop about his Java dream and mentioned his pest control work. "What's off?" But the worldly Lathrop seemed particularly impatient with this talkative young man. He said, "Why study microscopic things instead of plants people can use?" After disembarking in Europe, Fairchild parted ways with Lathrop, but he'd already made an impression. Lathrop quietly investigated Fairchild, found him driven and reliable, and decided to fund his Java expedition with $1,000 to find rare plants unavailable in America. Lathrop thought this far more meaningful than studying algae. $1,000 was serious money back then, 2 years' wages for an average person. But easygoing Fairchild didn't take it too seriously at first, preparing slowly while continuing his work. Only 11 months after receiving the funds, he sailed from Naples to Java, where he suddenly got fascinated by local termite mounds, spending ages observing them. This made Lathrop restless. He chased after Fairchild to Java. Over the next few months, they traveled together through many Malay archipelago islands, discovering exotic plants and having deep conversations. The Malay archipelago's abundant plant resources contrasted sharply with America's situation. Fairchild realized that introducing these plants, especially edible crops, to America would boost U.S. agricultural development. He finally understood Lathrop's original intention behind funding him. However, systematic plant introduction required official U.S. support. Upon returning to America, Fairchild proposed his plant introduction concept to the USDA. So, Agriculture Secretary James Wilson then became the third major influence on Fairchild. Wilson served the longest term as Agriculture Secretary in U.S. history, 16 years. Early in his tenure, he recognized crop scarcity severely hindered U.S. agricultural progress. While Fairchild was in Naples, Wilson had contacted him about citron fruit. Citron originated in Asia, spread to Europe, and is a foundational citrus fruit that hybridized into oranges, lemons, and grapefruits. Spanish colonists brought citron trees to California, but aging trees caused poor yields, forcing annual imports from Europe. In 1894, Wilson assigned Fairchild in Naples to Corsica, known for best citron, as a plant spy. On Corsica, non-French-speaking Fairchild painstakingly collected citron cuttings, preserving them by grafting onto potatoes. The starchy core of American potatoes provided nutrients to keep cuttings alive during long journeys. This mission convinced Wilson the young man was exceptionally reliable. When Fairchild returned from the Malay archipelago, Wilson realized it was time for large-scale U.S. plant introduction. With Wilson's advocacy, the proposal gained congressional support. In 1897, USDA established the Office of Seed and Plant Introduction with Fairchild in full charge. Initially, though, Fairchild handled administrative tasks, correspondence, and coordinating with overseas posts to collect plants and seeds. With most U.S. posts in Europe, the office introduced superior wheat, grapes, mushrooms, and pomegranates from there. Meanwhile, in southern Florida, the USDA also built a specialized botanical garden to trial overseas introduced plants. But office work wasn't what Fairchild wanted. Lathrop's return visit solidified his decision to personally embark on plant exploration. At their meeting, Lathrop told Fairchild, "I know nothing about chickens and am not suited to run a poultry farm." Likewise, you aren't either. Within the government, creating the Plant Introduction Office, Lathrop's words undoubtedly woke Fairchild up. The USDA was relatively poor, lacking funds to sponsor Fairchild's dedicated plant collecting expeditions. Lathrop's sponsorship solved this. This truly launched Fairchild on his plant exploration journey. All right, we've now covered the book's first major question. In the 19th century, America was relatively plant and resource poor. with even fewer cash crops, leading to monotonous diets. With support from visionary patrons, Fairchild embarked on expeditions to introduce plants to America.
Now for the second question. How Fairchild's plant explorations transformed U.S. agriculture?
From 1898 to 1903, 5 years, Fairchild's travels spanned every continent except Antarctica. His most significant journey started from the U.S., went south to South America, crossed the Atlantic to Europe, then through the Suez Canal to Africa and Asia. The last, whenever he found valuable plants during this time, he'd mail seeds or cuttings back to the U.S. He sent back over 17,000 plant species, averaging more than 10 per day, mostly traveling with Lathrop. Despite having a reliable companion, the expeditions were filled with hardships. For instance, crossing the Andes in South America, Fairchild's mule slipped on a mountain path, nearly throwing him off a cliff. In Papua, Southeast Asia, while searching for plants via small boat to a remote island, they were attacked by a storm of arrows from locals upon landing. Luckily, a quick escape saved his life. In Sri Lanka, Fairchild nearly died from typhoid fever and was almost evicted from his hotel. Thankfully, Lathrop pulled out his self-defense pistol, allowing Fairchild to remain at the hotel. Thanks to Lathrop's help, Fairchild traveled first class to London to fully recover from typhoid. Despite hardships, Fairchild achieved remarkable success, introducing attractive red corn from Peru.
From China, he brought several rice varieties. From Europe, squash, bell peppers, broccoli, and other premium vegetables.
From Southeast Asia came mangoes, pomelos, durians, and numerous fruits. Fairchild introduced over 80 mango varieties, with the Philippine Carabao mango, honey sweet and fiberless, being most successful. Earlier attempts with 3 Trinidad varieties yielded small, unappetizing mangoes. Innovative, transformative, improved Carabao became champagne mango widely cultivated in Florida. Americans marveled at its sweetness, unlike anything they'd tasted except pure sugar. His seedless grapes from Italy also deserve mention. He learned of a unique vine near Padua, red grapes bursting with flesh but seedless. Its origins were unknown, possibly brought by missionaries. Though seedless fruits weren't cultivated then, Fairchild recognized its value. Without seeds, he rooted vine cuttings at the monastery before sending them to America.
These cuttings birthed the Sultana seedless red grape in America.
Its sweetness and seedlessness revolutionized California's wine and raisin industries. Fairchild constantly sought new plants, even aboard ships, asking travelers, "What's the best fruit you've eaten?" The Chinese ambassador's wife recommended walnut-sized youngmei and longan as most delicious. This led Fairchild to Guangdong, China, where he acquired youngmei, longan, plus peaches, persimmons, olives, and loquats. By 1903, Fairchild became nationally famous for plant introduction, especially beloved by farmers. Because American farmers were poor back then, even with lots of farmland, they only grew a few crops. Overproduction drove prices way down. For example, oats and corn sold for just pennies per kilo, but introducing diverse cash crops like fruits gave farmers better options. These fetched higher prices, gradually making farmers wealthier. The plants he brought back slowly transformed America into an agricultural powerhouse. Today, U.S. food exports make up 10% of the global market. California and Florida's apples, grapes, oranges are world famous, all thanks to Fairchild's groundbreaking work. And the cotton Fairchild brought from Egypt not only revived America's cotton industry, but also built massive national wealth. From the 18th to 19th centuries, America grew cotton extensively and even exported it to Egypt. Though Egyptians only started cotton farming in the early 1800s, they developed Jumel cotton, Egyptian long staple, with far superior yield and quality. This made U.S. cotton less competitive globally. Plus, the Civil War halted U.S. exports, making Egypt the world's top producer. By the 1860s, America was importing cotton from Egypt. After Fairchild introduced Jumel cotton to America, it thrived in the climate, quickly upgrading U.S. cotton quality. Plus, it required less labor, solving workforce shortages after slavery ended.
Soon, cotton from Arizona and California reclaimed the global market.
Americans then kept refining cotton varieties. By World War II, Arizona's cotton research base alone had grown into a billion-dollar industry, massively boosting U.S. wealth. But Americans didn't accept every plant Fairchild introduced. Taste, growing difficulty affected their success. Fairchild introduced water chestnuts from China, also called horse hooves.
But since they grow in muddy swamps, U.S. farmers refused, too dirty to cultivate.
Similarly, taro from China wasn't widely grown because Americans disliked eating it. Even Fairchild's favorite fruit, the mangosteen, was rejected. He called it the queen of tropical fruits, with its stunning white flesh. Its flesh is finer than plums, with a fragrant, delicious taste that's hard to describe, but American farmers weren't convinced. They felt that, compared to other fruits, mangosteen had too thick a rind, too little flesh, and its oval shape wasn't plump enough, so it was discarded. Other neglected plants included quinoa, now popular with fitness buffs, and cashews, among others. Americans loved eating cashews, but farmers found them too finicky to grow. Importing from India was cheaper, so these plants only made a comeback years later. For instance, kale, brought from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, could absorb soil salts, preventing mineralization and compaction.
This plant was colorful and brightened up dull gardens, but it wasn't particularly tasty.
At first, Americans mainly used it as decoration. It wasn't until the 1990s that chemists discovered kale was rich in calcium, iron, and vitamin K, turning it into a trendy superfood. That wraps up the book's second question. Fairchild's work transformed American diets and agriculture, laying the foundation for the U.S. as a farming powerhouse. However, America's plant introduction efforts didn't keep going indefinitely. Next, we'll cover the book's third question. Why did this work gradually stop? In 1903, Fairchild stopped his plant hunting because he fell in love with a young woman. Her name was Marion. She was the daughter of Alexander Bell, inventor of the telephone. Fairchild met Marion at a salon hosted by Bell. Fairchild was 34 then, eager for a stable marriage. They tied the knot a year later. For his family, Fairchild gave up overseas exploration but stayed as head of the U.S. Seed and Plant Introduction Office, mentoring many protégés. The most famous among them was Frank Meyer, in whom Fairchild saw his younger self. He was a restless young man, itching for adventure. Starting in 1905, Meyer was sent to China 3 times, totaling 9 years. He traveled nearly every province, bringing back plants like soybeans, oats, millet, asparagus, thin-skinned watermelon, wild pears, and northeast spinach. There's a famous lemon variety called the Meyer lemon, reportedly discovered by Meyer near Beijing in 1908. But Meyer's sudden death dealt a heavy blow to U.S. plant introduction efforts. He often trekked solo through inland China. This was during China's late Qing and early Republic period, a time of social upheaval. Meyer faced bandit attacks multiple times, often left bloodied, and once nearly strangled. He also ran into hungry bears, tigers, and wolves. But none of that scared Meyer. What broke him, though, was mental health struggles. By 1917, Meyer was 42 and had spent 12 grueling years as a plant explorer in China. Not only was he physically worn out, but he also suffered from severe depression. The brutal warlord conflicts and the destruction of his hard-earned specimens in the war deeply traumatized him. He was all alone in China with no friends to talk to. In 1918, he jumped overboard from a steamship heading from Hangzhou to Shanghai, taking his own life. Later, to honor Meyer, the USDA created the Meyer Medal, awarded to plant introducers of exceptional integrity. If Meyer's death cost Fairchild his left arm, then the departure of another protege, Poppins, took his right arm. Poppins was incredibly gifted at spotting new plants, but he came from wealth and was coddled. To keep him, Fairchild gave him the easiest assignments in the safest areas. But Poppins eventually quit plant exploration. Without his key helpers, Fairchild also faced tougher plant quarantine rules. This brings us to Fairchild's childhood friend and neighbor, Charles Marlatt. Marlatt headed the USDA's entomology lab and was Fairchild's best man, but they clashed badly over plant introduction. Marlatt feared introducing plants would bring pests and diseases, thinking the risks outweighed the rewards. Fairchild did believe pest issues deserved attention,
but argued that bringing in foreign plants, especially crops, would boost U.S. agriculture so much that the benefits outweighed the risks.
Their conflict started over bringing in cherry blossom trees. After marriage, Fairchild lived near Washington, D.C. and adored Japanese cherry blossoms. He planted many cherry trees in his garden, the first such trees in America. By 1910, Fairchild's cherry trees drew media attention. President Taft and his wife also loved them, sparking proposals to plant cherry trees across Washington. During the Russo-Japanese War, Japan saw this as a chance to court U.S. favor. Japan offered 2,000 prime cherry saplings. Fairchild helped negotiate the donation. But when saplings arrived, Marlatt objected. He warned of pest risks and demanded inspections, revealing scale insects, borers, and over 10 pests in the roots. Marlatt emphasized the dangers. White scale insects could kill entire orchards. Ultimately, all 2,000 trees were burned at the port. Japan later sent sanitized replacements, but public fear about foreign plant pests had already ignited. Led by Marlatt, the 1914 Plant Quarantine Act passed, with tightening restrictions over time. All plant imports now required strict inspections. Private introductions were banned. Today, mass plant introduction and quarantine aren't inherently conflicting. Rigorous checks ensure safety. But in the 1920s, Marlatt's campaigning wildly exaggerated pest threats. The Plant Introduction Office faced endless obstacles shipping plants home. By the mid-1920s, the office was nearly paralyzed. In 1923, Fairchild left the office, ending his plant exploration career. This concludes the book's third point. Fairchild's retirement, loss of protégés, and strict quarantines halted large-scale plant introduction. Fairchild's work finally came to a halt. In 1954, Fairchild died at 85 in Florida, buried under a Java fig tree, one of the plants he introduced. Today, botanists still find new plant varieties worldwide, but large-scale foreign plant introduction by a country is unlikely to repeat. Firstly, plant varieties are now valuable resources, tightly controlled by nations. Secondly, most plant species have spread globally due to explorers' efforts. Plants once rare are no longer exotic treasures seen only by a few explorers. That's the end of our exploration. Reading notes are below the audio. See you next time.